Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Flushing Town Hall. My name is Ellen Kodadek, and I'm the Executive and Artistic Director of Flushing Council on Culture and the Arts. And we restored and program and manage this beautiful historic building on behalf of New York City. Last year, Flushing Town Hall was 150 years old, and next year, Flushing Council is going to be 35 years old. So we have a very long history of presenting global arts for our global community here in Flushing. We're going to start today's program with a panel discussion where we will be taking questions from the audience at some point. And then we have our concert at 4 o'clock, and then at 7:30 we're encouraging musicians to come back with their instruments, and there'll be a composition workshop with Jason as well. We have today on our panel not only Jason Kao Hwang, but also Professor Jack Chen, who's the founder and director of the Asian Pacific American Program and Institute at NYU, and also the co-founder of the Museum of Chinese in America. So you're in very good hands here, and without any further ado, Jason, Jack.
Thanks, Ed.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here, and this is a conversation I've been wanting to have with Jason for a long time. I knew Jason back in the days that he had a full head of hair. It's changed a little bit, but we've been together. We've known each other since the late 70s. Yeah. I knew him originally as a poet from the Midwest. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I knew him originally as a poet from the Midwest, and we met each other through an organization called Basement Workshop, which was doing a lot of cultural and arts and educational work down around Chinatown back at the time. Yeah. I'm also a historian, and I just wanted to kind of note a couple of things since we're here in this really unique place of Flushing. Now, of course, people think of Flushing as a great place to come for Asian foods and Asian groceries, and there's so many different Asian groups who are living here, but of course it's been a history of lots of different groups that have been in this place. As a historian, I'm going back to not only when Frederick Douglass was speaking here, and Jason was telling me that Louis Armstrong also performed here, but also one of the very first Chinese who came to this country in 1812 is when we have a record of him. We have records of him going through Flushing to visit the Quaker church that's just nearby. And his name was Kuo Wei Tchen. We don't really know much about him, but he had come to New York to collect a debt that was owed to him from some of the very first people who had set out the Empress of China in 1784, which was the first ship of the new nation after the Revolution. New York was terribly burnt out in great poverty, and the hope was that this ship going to China would be able to help bring some wealth to this very poor, struggling nation. And they got ginseng from the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. They gathered together what kind of gold coins and silver coins they could, and they went to China, successfully came back, made a lot of money. In fact, had another ship come back to make even more money that they had hired on their way. But what we discovered, here in the archives, is that this guy, that they never paid their bills. Okay? So they came back to this country, and they really made their money. And poor, Wing Chong ended up coming to collect the bills that were never paid from 1785. So there's something really special about this place and the layering of histories of different groups that are here.
Well, just, Jack and I meeting at Basement Workshop, I was 19, and I went to St. Mark's Bookstore, which is right next to this haircutting salon run by the Hells Angels. There's always like around 20 bikes out front, and then there's this legendary bookstore. And I saw a flyer. It said Basement Workshop, Poetry Workshop for Asian Americans. And I actually think that was the first time I saw those two words put together, Asian Americans. And I thought, well, that's me. And basement workshop, you know, those few years it was together in Lafayette has its place in history. And as you can tell from what Jack has just said, he was one of the first, not the first, but an early wave of scholars who made Asian American history an important area of study. Because if you think at that time, very few Asian Americans were published or seen on TV or seen in the movies. And so there was this history that Jack has made his work to investigate and to, you know, bring into the American lore. So that's, and you could tell from his historical context of this location, you know, how wonderful that scholarship is. He's written a book on, what was the title?
It's called New York Before Chinatown.
Yeah, it's great.
So, Jason, I may be the last person you want to ask to talk about music. But in fact, I really thought it would be useful for us to kind of hear a little bit about where your music comes from and the musical inspiration that you have. I mean, let's kind of start with what you're doing now. You know, and I know your recent album was dedicated to your mother who passed away.
Right.
But also, it's more than that. Clearly, I mean, there's a lot of cross-cultural issues that you're dealing with. But it'd be great to kind of hear you, in your words, kind of talk about what do you hear, what it is that's going on.
Well, and from a biographical standpoint, when I was in college, there was in New York a lively jazz scene in the lofts. And what drew me into that music was the values that that music espoused, which was individualism and having your own voice. And that actually resonated very powerfully with the Asian American movement. But when I think a lot about this question about where does my sound come from, and I just did some reading about the law of the conservation of energy, where energy is neither created or destroyed, and therefore every sound we make, every word we utter, that sound wave theoretically continues forever. You know, it can change into energy form. Now that may sound very abstract, but we have this experience, for example, in this room. So much has been heard and played. Have you ever been in a room where the room felt sad and you don't know why? Or you go into a little kindergarten, the kids aren't there, but you feel all that joyful energy. So we do have these visceral experiences that the vibrations of what happened in that space is contained in that room. And so this is also like how certain involuntary sounds we make, say like how we laugh. Should I do this? Sometimes with audiences I ask you to laugh with me for 20 seconds and listen to everyone's laugh and how unique it is, and listen to how you hear not only their personality, but a sense of their history. And sometimes in all our laughter, there's joy and there's sadness. There's a lot in one's laugh. So maybe we'll make, I know, less embarrassing, let's laugh for 10 seconds. Okay? Here we go. Okay, so. My wife and I went to a yoga camp, and there was a 30-minute laughing meditation, which really is good for the core muscles. But you hear someone in the corner, the sound sounded like a hyena, and then someone else, cackled, but that sound, is how we try to play. If we play with the same sense of abandon that you do when you are convulsed with laughter, that type of command in the moment, that sound is you. That is my image of playing.
Well, Jason, it's interesting that you bring this up. First of all, you're saying the sound and how it continues to live on. And a place like this, which is so historic, I believe there actually are the vibrations of people who've been here. And certainly in Chinese culture, there's an idea that is kind of, from a Western point of view, oh, it's ghosts, you don't believe in ghosts, that's superstitious. But I think the sense of spirit and sound kind of continuing on in a place, and a feeling of a place is actually quite real, right? And I think the fact that this was a place in which the Quakers actively fought against slavery, for example, and really didn't believe in, and in this building, is quite important, And in some ways, I think the tradition of this ensemble, performing here, is incredibly important. But getting back to the sound thing, I mean, in some ways, I know when I laugh for a long time, I start tearing up. I start, crying in some ways, and it's in some ways it's more than simply being happy, right? We think of laughter as somehow being happy, but it's also this release of energy and spirit, right? Something about that.
It's a pre-consciousness, coming to the fore, and so tying that into music, then it's about making all these vibrations of the past that's coursing through us. I mean, all the words in the world ever spoken are in vibration, and they coalesce into waves and troughs and movements and history. And at an individual level, the musician is then trying to make those vibrations come out and be heard sonically again. It gives it form again. And that's why musicians not only tune themselves practicing like they practice scales, so then they're open to the vibration of playing a scale or doing that. You're always tuning yourself to a rhythm. Can I feel that rhythm? And so it's the same with the overall experience of music, is we're making these vibrations take form. And that accounts for cross-cultural vibrations and it's just not me. It's never about one person. This music is always, all music is never about the individual. It's always, the ensemble, whether it's classical or jazz.
Well, I see we've got a couple of young girls in this room, and I don't know if they're practicing piano or music. I don't. Are you guys playing any instruments or anything? Yeah. Okay. Now I know that when music is being taught traditionally, we're kind of following certain. We're trying to reproduce certain pieces of music that have already been done. Right? So a lot of it's that, right? I don't know what it is that you guys are doing, but you probably are, practicing the scales and also practicing certain pieces and repeating it. But Jason, you're really talking about, you're a composer as well. And in some ways it sounds like, catching on to these sounds and tuning into this from the past and the present and the future seems a little mystical, but in fact, as a composer, you're not following things that have already been written. And in fact, you're trying to create something a little different. You're trying to, so maybe you could talk about that creative process, because I think it'd actually be for these young future musicians and composers, it actually might be good for you to kind of convey what process you actually go through.
Yeah, I agree. I think music especially can mystify people, how it's created. I mean, sound is our most acute sense. I mean, vision is only, you see what's in front of you. Sound is 360, and actually the mind processes sound so much faster than what's visual. A sound can make you scared in a millisecond. And so the art of improvisation, I do compose some occasionally classical work, which everything is notated. But for improvisation, I try to compose to bring out each individual and then their vibrations into the stream. So it's collaborative. For example, Ken Filiano on bass, Andrew Drury, it's the core members of the quartet. We've created this music together. But the act of creativity is actually common. We just have to see it. When we talk, we do not read from a script. We don't say Jack's asking me a question and I'm not writing it down and then I'm writing my response and then I read it to him. We're actively engaged in the spontaneous exchange of ideas and language, and in a sense, not even what we say, it's how we say it. Has that energy of how we say it, which is musical, is probably more important than what we say to some extent. So the creative process is every day. I think George Lewis over at Columbia University is writing a book about the act of improvisation in daily life. And so for jazz, when people study, it's to tune themselves to be a better instrument for this music, to let the music come through them in all sorts of ways. So if you play, a C dominant 7th chord raised 11th, that can sound very technical, but that's a sound. That's a sound to awaken a consciousness, So all these things of music theory and all that the purpose is of the craft. It's not the craft itself or being self-referential. It's really designed to shock your consciousness into a feeling and open it to something new.
So part of what I'm hearing you say is that, of course, you're talking about listening deeply from the members of your ensemble, and also, I assume, studying past recordings. In some ways, that suggests the way in which the past, as a ghost, perhaps from the past, exists in the present. When we have these 78s or sound recordings, you're actually listening to a sound that emerged from a person who was living 100 years ago, 200 years ago, whatever, right? So part of the improvisation is necessarily engaging with that past, and people's individual pasts were part of your active group. Is that a good way?
Sure. I mean, I think in our music, I think in all music, there has to be that element of empathy, so that we're listening to each other. And especially in this ensemble, which has Chinese instruments and Western instruments, it is that empathy where I think when you hear the concert today, at first your ear will go to the Chinese instruments because maybe that's new. And so I might have the arhu play a line with the string bass, so your ear and your eye go to the arhu. But once you become conditioned to this universe and the sounds become equal, then it's just sound. But I do think too in the language of our compositions or improvisations, for myself, I think about it, like, why do I think the way I think and sound the way I sound? And, as an Asian American, when I grew up, it was the era of the melting pot. So my 3 older sisters, my oldest sister was bilingual, but then she got beat up a lot in the school ground, because we were the only 2 Chinese families in a city of about 70,000, Waukegan, Illinois. And so when I was born, my parents said, well, he needs a little smoother time going to kindergarten, and we're only going to speak English to him. So my childhood, my upbringing, I'm always accustomed to my parents, when they wanted to speak of something private, they would speak in Chinese. And I would listen really carefully, like, are they talking about me? What are they saying? And to me then, that Chinese especially is a tonal language. That was my formative musical experience, because my parents didn't really play that much music at home and that sort of thing. So, but that language was there. In fact, recently I live in Jersey City. There's a Chinese restaurant, and for some reason it's filled with Chinese people. And I go, where'd they all come from? Because we lived in this neighborhood for years. And I went, wow. And also, they're speaking in the Beijing accent. They got those rolling R's from the Beijing dialect. But it reminded me of my parents' home when they had friends over. I hadn't heard that sound in so long, so it really touched me.
Well, it must mean that the place has really good food. Yeah. Of course, Chinese will go for hundreds of miles to go to a good restaurant. But, let's stick to this idea of the history a little bit of the jazz history itself, right? Because, of course, Americans think of it as primarily African American, although it's far more complicated than that, especially now. And certainly jazz emerges out of a blues tradition as well, which is so much about, in many ways, New Orleans and the Mississippi, and of course it's in New York too, but it emerges out of the South. And the intermixing that happens in a place like New Orleans, where it's a port, and there are many sounds coming together, and people are both surviving, but also creating something new that's very American. And many people say, unlike European classical music, that it's really the blues and jazz which constitute original American music, right? So jazz, so what's an Asian guy like you, playing the jazz, which in some people think it's African American. So what right does an Asian have to do with playing that?
Well, the greatest innovators in jazz, there's been many contributors, but the greatest innovators have been African American. And, the music is so great that it reaches all people, and it can embrace all other people, can hear that music, and they can feel the experience of the blues or something. It's that the human expression transcends, ethnicity at its greatest and culture. But and I think especially when the post-Coltrane generation, it began to music opened to world influences, and then it began to appeal to more people to reimagine themselves in music. So actually, through improvisation as a cultural location, is a place where actually one can find and construct identity, because I'm listening to the sound of my laughter, and I'm trying to decide what is the meaningful vibrations that are coming into my life, and trying to tune myself to them. So I think that all that is true, but the music is transcendent.
I know a little bit about John Coltrane because one of my graduate students has been writing about how Coltrane was actually trying to take Indian music very seriously and was kind of engaging with it in this really interesting way that we don't really know much about. And as a consequence, as a musician, he was, I think, always searching for sounds, right? He was always searching for a sound that would sound fresh and interesting to him, and that probably it was part of the process of what fed his spirit. So there's been actually this history of within the jazz tradition, African Americans kind of searching out for other kinds of experiences and other ways of kind of thinking about and composing.
Sure. Duke Ellington, when he was at the Cotton Club, he had Chinese opera instruments in the rhythm section. Where the heck did he get that? While he was passing through San Francisco, he must have seen Chinese opera, and the drummer said, I really like those sounds, and they picked up wood blocks and gongs and stuff like that. So, it was always there,
Well, do you think that's okay to do? I mean, so we can say that, well, the Beatles also did the same with South Asian music, and did they somehow unfairly take it in? Or maybe the question is, what would be a fair way to engage with the music of certain people that comes out at a certain time, and what's a not a good way?
Well, definitely the world is not fair, there are cases of cultural appropriation where one group profited and the other did not, and the other was the originating group, and the one appropriating was not the same artistic level. And so
Elvis Presley, for example, how he made a huge career and lots of money based on music that was actually going around locally and regionally.
Sure. There's maybe less extreme examples today, but I think as an artist, your job then is to just really create something that you feel is honest, that you're contributing and doing something good, and you try to present yourself honestly as to what you want to achieve. And then as the world processes that, you try to manage what you think is incorrect and try to help others or address issues that have to be addressed, because still today, race ethnicity is a very easy way to organize the world. But, your aesthetics, your views, your politics, there's tremendous diversity amongst every race. Arguably class is a much more distinctive grouping that might represent a class of people might have certain attitudes versus an ethnicity. But so it's very complex. It's a complex world, and because we don't have the time to think about it, the world oversimplifies. Even as a presenter, when you're producing a festival or whatever, you try to have ethnic diversity. And so that means you're not just thinking of the music, but ethnicity is this visual way that people understand that, yes, there's diversity here, but it's very complex.
So, I'm thinking back, I do a lot of study of 19th century American culture and what happened on the stage. And of course, we're familiar with film representations of, let's say, Charlie Chan, it was Warner Roland, as Charlie Chan, or if you ever seen, and I would encourage you to take a look at this, in 1932 there was the Boris Karloff played Fu Manchu. You can see it online today. And of course both of them were in yellowface. And they were told, they were dressed a certain way, they looked a certain way, and they imagined that they were behaving in a Chinese-like fashion. So there's that kind of representation, right? Which is kind of a rip-off. It's kind of like somebody who doesn't know anything about Chinese food selling it to people saying it's Chinese food, right? Maybe you put a little soy sauce on rice somehow,
There was a friend of mine that, I'll say the most general terms so they won't be identified, but they would perform contemporary music wearing traditional Asian clothing. And they said, Jason, backstage, even when I'm going to the bathroom, everyone just gets out of my way with this reverence. Because she's wearing the traditional clothes. And I said, well, you know what? There's advantages for you to go with that, but it'd be much more interesting if you destroy that. Because, it's for myself, I don't like the manufacture of a star persona, because a star persona means you're above everybody, and they're at a distance. And I will pay more money because they're far away. They fulfill the archetype of the firmament of stars, But the music should be about destroying that and bringing us closer as a one-to-one human community. And that's a real collision of what many artists face. And still, yet here I am on stage, and I hope people to buy a ticket to hear us.
Well, but we're growing up in American culture. I mean, I grew up in the Midwest, and I didn't listen to much Chinese music, except for my mother singing off tune, that kind of thing. But I would watch movies and listen to the radio, and I would hear things like the gong, and anytime there's a gong, you'd usually it'd be introducing somebody who is Oriental, quote-unquote Oriental, coming onto the stage and coming onto the screen. Or you'd hear the phrase, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? And those phrases now kind of represent in American culture, even to this day, something kind of engaging, right?
Well, I think when you hear the concert today, like I was saying initially, because the sound is new and the image is new of a traditional Chinese instrument, that catches your ear and your eye right away. So then there can't be that signification of something, Asian is happening. And indeed, the historical legacy of the instrument, it's indelible. It's in the players, from that repertoire they came through, that sound, what's in their finger memory, in their phrase, and how they engage. The history of that music is there. So that's always there. But I think what we try to achieve in this ensemble today is, once you enter this universe of sound, pretty soon then the sonic experience becomes democratic, and all the sounds are equal, and they have a role. And yet, the historical legacy of every instrument, it's still there. I'm still the violin and the argo and the pipa. And for myself, when I have a piece with Chinese instruments, it is a biographical resonance. When we were talking about Coltrane, who's that professor at Rutgers, Lewis Porter's bio of Coltrane, the thing that struck me was, when he was 12 or 13, he lost his father, he lost his grandmother, he lost half the adults in his family, and then he got really introverted and started practicing. What blew my mind was Naima, his great ballad. Lewis found all the songs his father loved at the time, And some of the ballads his father liked was so much like Naima that great purpose of Coltrane and the power of his playing was he was bringing his father back to me. And so in a certain way, when I have Chinese instruments, it does have that biographical resonance, because that perhaps, what I imagine, is the sound of my parents or of my life. And I say imagine because, I think, Asian, we talk about ethnicity, it isn't like because you're Chinese that you've got automatic, understanding of what's Chinese. I mean, I struggled to get a B when I took Mandarin at college, So I was hoping it would just come on,
Somehow language is in your gene.
It was hard. But our history makes us imagine ourselves. So even though, like say, for Wang Kuo Wei or Sun Li, when they listen to traditional music, they grew up with it, they played with it and all that. For me, it's something different, It represents a certain idea, and their sound is a certain idea. And so if you think of your speaking voice, or of this whole ensemble as a single organism that has a singing voice, then those sounds are part of the overtones of the whole voice. And all their instruments are flowing into it.
Well, I know we have to watch our time, so let me know when we need to stop.
Wrap up pretty soon.
Sorry, because we can go on, and that's part of why I'm really so happy that we can have this discussion. And I think we probably should continue some other time, but maybe I'll ask you one more thing, okay? Which is, let's go in the direction of neuroscience, okay? Because we started out talking about ghosts that might be in this building, for the sounds that have been here, and certainly musicians certainly understand that, let's say, a violin or an instrument that was owned by somebody before is not only valuable, because of who had played that instrument and the sounds that are still vibrating and conditioned into the wood and the strings, right? That's still very much. But there's an additional scientific kind of discovery, I think, as we're beginning to probe the brain and how our bodies really work, and that's in terms of course, there's a lot of MRAs about the brain and what happens in music and creativity when that happens in the brain. But the other part of things that has not been really gotten to yet, and I'm hoping maybe these two young girls, if, other than being musicians, they might go into some other area of research. Sorry to keep on picking on you guys, but would be checking out this other dimension of what some scientists are calling the second brain. And the second brain, of course, we intuitively know this, which is really from our kind of nose, mouth, down through our chest, and through to our belly button, okay? And, certainly in terms of any of you who practice Tai Chi Chuan or know the Asian kind of philosophies about martial arts and the body, the center of the body is below your belly button. You are not up here, right? Which is more of a Western sense. Somehow I am what my brain is or what I see, and see myself through the mirror. But the center of the body and the center of energy is actually down here, which really speaks to an electrical kind of field and energy. So what you feel, let's say when we hear the music, is oftentimes not just in the ear, but through the body, especially up here. That's where the emotions really are. So I don't know what you can do with that, but it seems to me that the music that you're working with really, in some ways, is with the second brain.
Yeah, I think every musician practices to get that alignment of heart, spirit, body into a singular sound and action, and that gives you your conviction, and that's something that we strive for, and not always achieve, but then you hear the act of striving, we're trying to line those up. So that aspect of meditation or whatever is definitely a musical consciousness. Yeah.
Well, listen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, so it was great. And
thanks
you
everyone
for
for
being
hanging
here.
out. We'll be playing about 15 minutes.